All right, so we're looking here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Specifically, I want to look at verses 1 through 5. 2 and 3, it says, Now I, Paul, myself beseech you with the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold towards you. But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence wherewith I think to be bold against some which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. We'll go down and we'll read that some more in just a minute. But I just want to look at this here and think about this and think about Paul. That's what we want to talk about tonight. We were talking about Peter last week, and I want to talk about Paul a little bit tonight. And there's very little in the Bible written about Paul, so we're really going to have to, grasp at some straws here. No, I'm kidding about that. There's more written about Paul than most. And so I just want to look at this, though, and I want to think about how it is that Paul became basically, I say maybe at least it's seems to me this way. How is he the second most talked about man in churches today? And I mean, you think about this, it seems like many times if the pastor's not preaching about Jesus or God, he's preaching about Paul. It just kind of seems that way. It's kind of an easy go-to. You can talk about Paul and what Paul was doing and what Paul was teaching. But the reason is because there's so much that we can draw from about Paul. He was a great, not only just a man of God, but just a great man in general, I think. And then, his work ethic, his discipline, which is what I want to look at tonight. And then, being steadfast, being sure. The trials and the tribulations that he endured, all the things that he went through are just mighty. And it's incredible to read about. The letters that he writes to the churches and the other church leaders, and really just motivating them and teaching them and instructing them is just solid. So it's no wonder that we talk so much about Paul. And pay attention to this. I love this in verse 18, and I think this is really what speaks volumes of Paul and many mighty men of God. In verse 18 it says, For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. Okay, and so thinking about this, a commendation or a recommendation or to commend here, what it's talking about is basically just to say that you're praising or you're recommending somebody. And there's definitely a difference between somebody who is recommended by somebody else versus somebody who's just recommending themselves or boasting about themselves. So one thing I hate doing is talking about myself. I imagine it would be so hard to shoot a promotional video or a commercial for something because you're just having to talk about yourself and promote yourself and put yourself out there. So much easier rather to just have somebody else, recommend you. If you've got a business, I think there's not a better referral than a word of mouth referral, right? Anybody can watch a commercial, but that word of mouth referral goes so much further. And so true as it is in the Bible that, not he that commendeth himself is approved, but it says there, but whom the Lord commendeth. And Paul is definitely a man that was called by God. He was used by God. He was used by God his whole life, I believe, just used in mighty ways, and definitely not only called by God, but he was commended by God. He was sent by God. He was men were used instrumentally that God had gotten a hold of, and really in drawing him and using him and all that. So it's really neat to see that, and definitely God's hand was in that. So it's no surprise then, because he's not, commending himself. He's not talking about himself here, although sometimes he does seem to have to do that. He does have to seem to boast on himself or talk about himself or to talk about his authority or to flex his muscles. I see even here, he says, I wish that I could come just softly. I wish that I didn't have to be strong with you. But, apparently I've got some reputation to where, I'm bold in my letters. I'm harsh when I speak in letters or when I'm absent from you. But then when I come, that I'm meek and mild or I'm this way. He says, I'll be bold with you in person if I have to. Now, I hope that I don't have to. But what he says here, is that, so he even has to kind of boast on his authority or boast on his boldness, which I see as just almost unnatural. He would rather not have to do that. And so, that's why we find in like chapter 11 and other places where he's, glorying in his infirmities is what he would rather do. He says, what, I'd actually rather be put aside and give God the glory. So where is Paul on a different level than most humans? It's not necessarily his survival. And I say that in such a way because we serve the same God that Paul served, okay? We are given the same charge that many men in the Bible are given. And whether Paul was, I believe that his survival, like physical survival, was not just with his own physical abilities to endure, shipwrecks and beatings and all these types of things, but the fact that God's hand was with him. And so, I think that his survival was more miraculous than it was just physical strength, okay? So I don't want us to think of these and be like, well, Paul was just on a different level, physically, and I'll never be there. And I don't think that's the case. I think that his survival is miraculous, but, there's coming a time when we're all going to have to suffer persecution or trials or afflictions. We're all going to have to make decisions. And if we just think that we're weak and there's other men that are better suited and we'll just roll over and give up, then you know what? You've not even given God a chance to even work through you. So, that's more just miraculous there. But rather, I think that Paul is on a different level in his mindset, in the mindset that he had to be steadfast, to be sure. That is something that, I definitely can't speak for all men and I can't speak through all ages, but I think today that is definitely something that we need to take away from this, that we can understand, is the mindset that Paul had, and it'll go a long way. So in 2 Corinthians 10 and 5, check out this mindset. He says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Okay, so bringing in every thought to the obedience of Christ. Okay, any high thing that exalts itself, anything that wants to, that we want to look up to, anything that would become even idolatry. We could talk about it this way, the things that we worship, the things that we bow down, all the things that we want to focus our time on and spend our time on. So they can bring all these things down, and it says, bring him captive every thought to the obedience of Christ, and then having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. So there he's talking about, treating them and teaching them. So he's different in that regard when it comes to his mindset. So what we're talking about here is the ability to not be ruled by the flesh, if you will. Now, let's not forget in Romans chapter 7, where Paul is going back and forth and talking about the flesh versus the spirit. Okay, that's, a classic passage. And I think we've all kind of read that and been like, okay, so he is human. He does go through things, okay? The things that he wants to do, those he doesn't do. The things that he doesn't want to do, those things that he does. These types of, this battle that takes place daily, it seems like, between humans. It's nice to read that and see that, he was human. But at the same time, though, the trials and the afflictions that he went through, the things that he said, the things that he was teaching, the man that he wasn't ruled by his flesh. And even before he knew Christ, before he got saved, he was not ruled by his flesh. He was disciplined. And so we'll see that. So many of us today, we just do what we feel like doing, or we don't do what we don't feel like doing. And it's easy to fall into that. Even just recently in our church, so many people have been sick over the last 2 weeks, back and forth, different family members and whole families, and it's been sweeping through. How many have dropped your determination when you were sick just last week, as far as determined to stay on your resolution or a commitment that you made? You were going to try really hard to do this or do that, and then what happens is we get sick, and it's like, oh, forget it, I don't even care, right? I mean, I'm guilty of that. I could be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to get back on my eating plan. I'm going to be real strict with this. I need to get after it. And then you get sick and it's like, I don't care. This is what I want. Just give it to me. Right? So we just cast it away. And why? Well, because I'm sick, because, I'm just not feeling very well. That's my excuse, right? Well, you know what? Compared to what men in the Bible have endured, that's nothing, right? That's nothing. So I'm not down on everybody for your diet or your exercises or your discipline. But I just think that it's kind of neat if there's a way that we can kind of gauge ourselves. I mean, that's a pretty real gauge right here, just when we get sick with a little bit of sickness. So there's 2 lessons that Paul can teach us. And the first, but before we do, let's look briefly at Paul's life and consider the messenger in the Bible that God used to charge us with. So what do we find here in the Bible? If you look in Philippians chapter 2, we're actually going to be in Acts primarily. But But if we look in Philippians chapter 3, I just want to read a couple of verses here. In Philippians chapter 3, what do we find here? This is just a little bit of a backstory here, talking, from his own lips. He says, though I might have confidence in the flesh, though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. So, of course, this is, Paul going back and talking about, who he was. He says that he was circumcised the 8th day, which is perfect, okay, of the house, of the stock of Israel, which is perfect, of the tribe of Benjamin, which is perfect, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, okay, which is perfect. As touching the law, a Pharisee. There's no more perfection than being a Pharisee, okay? So he's perfect in all these things. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteous, which is in the law, blameless, okay? So he could do no wrong. He had it all. He was totally perfect. This is the confidence in the flesh right here. This is everything that a man needs with our own eyes, right? But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Okay, so what do we find here is all these types of things were perfect. And so to go back into Acts and to look at this, what I want to see here is that Paul was instrumental in spreading the gospel in Acts chapter 8. In Acts chapter 8, now we've just come here from Stephen being martyred and Saul here, instrumental in the spreading of the gospel. He says, and Saul was consenting unto his death, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial, and made a great lamentation over him. And as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house, and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. So what we find here is that he is going through, he is persecuting, he is charging, he is actually there, he is witnessing this. If we look in 9, 1 through 3, it says, and Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went into the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So what we find here is Paul is a go-getter. He is not even satisfied to persecute the Christians around him where he's at. He says, I got to do more. Where else can I go? I'm going to go and I'm going to get a charge to where I can go out to Damascus, and any along the way that I find, I'm going to bring them in. I'm going to bring them into Jerusalem. We're going to persecute them. We're going to make this trouble stop. We're going to try to squash this Christianity thing is what's going on here. And so he is motivated. He's driven. And this is before Christ gets a hold of him. All right? This is when he's still, a great persecutor of the church. He wants to know what more he can do, if you will. But in verses 4, we'll keep reading here. Verse 4, very familiar passage. 9:4, it says, and he fell to the earth. So in 3, as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And as he fell to the earth, he heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the man which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man, but they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. So what do we find here then is that he was made blind so that he may see. Now, Gerardo and I have got a joke that we say, you might have heard us talk about it, and it's not entirely a false statement, but it's said by some men that before you can get somebody saved, you got to get them lost, right? And so the joke is, we talk about getting saved people lost so that we can get them saved again, and that's the joke. But truly, you have to show somebody that they're a sinner before they need Jesus Christ, right? That they need Christ before they'll get saved. So you've got to make sure they know that they're lost, and then you can get them saved. And so that's true, that's accurate, and that is what we strive to do. Like I said, we joke about it, but more in a different sense. But that's absolutely what I see going on here. I see Saul being made blind that he may have vision, that he may see, right? So this isn't where he's saved. This is where he is exposed to Jesus Christ. It's where he is made known that there is a God and that he's actually not following God. He's not following the right God. And remember, he was zealous before. He thought that he was doing the right thing, but you know what? He was just doing it in ignorance. He was not following the Lord, but he was he was zealous for what he was doing. So he was made blind that he might see. And honestly, this is maybe just an extreme example of being humbled. Just the type of place that a man needs to be when he can finally cry out to God sometimes. Oftentimes, maybe not often, but sometimes you'll even hear a man with a testimony, a salvation testimony. And what you'll find is the time before he comes to know Christ, that he's actually going through a hard time in his life. Now it doesn't necessarily have to be a jailhouse conversion, although that's not uncommon. But you'll just find all kinds of times in a man's life, and a lady as well, but where they're just, some people might call it, rock bottom, where they've just, this has gone wrong, and this has gone wrong, and this has gone wrong, and their life is on the rocks, and they're at the brink, and, they're not sure how much more they can take, and that's the point where they get to, and then, finally, they're receptive to God. Is there a God? Why is my life looking this way? If there is a God, why does he want my life to look this way? You know what I mean? So it's kind of that place where a man finds himself, where he's finally able to lift his eyes and look to the Lord. And so this, kind of here illustrates that to me. But we're going to pick this up at the end. Don't expect everybody to have that type of a testimony, okay? Don't expect everybody to kind of come to that. So, I see that here. And then in verses 10 through 18, what we see him is actually getting saved. It says, "And there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him said the Lord in a vision, Ananias, and he said, Behold, I am here, Lord. And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the street, which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for the one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he prayeth. And has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many this man how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from the chief priests to bind all that call on thy name. But the Lord said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings of the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. And Ananias went his way and entered into the house, and putting his hands on him, said, Brother Saul, the Lord, even Jesus that appeared unto thee in the way as thou camest, hath sent me, that thou mightest receive thy sight and be filled with the Holy Ghost. And immediately there fell from his eyes as it had been scales, and he received sight forthwith, and arose and was baptized. So what do we find here is that Paul is saved and he is baptized, and the Lord used Ananias to get him saved, which is exactly how God uses to get men saved today, is with another man, with a saved man that God is using. God is not out here saving people with, blinding lights and revelations and mysterious voices and these types of things, but he does use men, he draws men, and he, allows us to go out and to do his work and to be faithful in him, to walk in his instruction and with his guidance, and preach the gospel, the Bible, and show people how to be saved, and so they can get saved and get baptized. And that's exactly what we find here. So this model of Paul's salvation is absolutely still used today, not so much in the miraculous humbling factor at the beginning, but still the using another man to get him saved is the exact same way that we still get people saved today, using the Bible, but through another man. So what we find here is that Paul was left blind and wanting until he met with an Ananias. Okay, you say, well, he definitely got saved on the road. Well, he left that encounter blind still, and hungry and thirsty, I'd imagine, because it says he was 3 days without eating or drinking. So he's gone. He was still wanting, and it wasn't until he met with Ananias, and I think what's kind of funny is in 18, and maybe it's just how I see it, but he was baptized before he even ate. And I imagine he's hungry. He's like, man, let me get some food, and then we'll go get baptized. He's like, no, I got saved. I need to get baptized. Now we're going to, then we'll get after the other things that we need to feed our flesh with. What we find right away, straight after that, is he gets busy working for Christ. In 19, it says, and when he had received meat, he was strengthened. Then was Saul certain days with the disciples which were at Damascus, and straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. But all that heard him were amazed, and said, is not this he that destroyed them which called on his name in Jerusalem, and came hither for that intent he might bring them bound to the chief priests? But Saul increased the more in strength, and confounded the Jews which dwelled at Damascus, proving that this is very Christ. And after that many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him. So what we find here is that Paul he had to overcome his bad reputation, and quickly he has death threats. So straight away he meets Christ, he gets saved, he gets baptized, he's hanging around these guys, these disciples. He's connecting the dots and putting the pieces together, and he's telling everybody that he can. He's preaching, he's telling them, hey, this is who God is. You guys need to believe. And straight away, not only does he have to overcome this bad reputation, which really speaks a lot for him, just personally, that he had even a bad reputation. I mean, he was well known. He was serious about his business. So now he's just as serious about the Lord's work. He's just as serious about going out and preaching to people that he would have been persecuting. And so he's causing trouble. It says even in 23, and after that many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him. So, he's been converted. He's gone to the other side. He needs to be taken out of the way. So he gets these death threats. Now, what do we find in Acts chapter 11? If you look just right over here in 25. In 25 it says, Then departed Barnabas to Tarsus for to seek Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him into Antioch, and it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people, and the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. And in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Abagus, and it goes on from there. So what we see, though, is that Barnabas and Paul are joined, and they head to Antioch. And what's going on at Antioch? This is a major hub here, all kinds of things going on, and so he's just getting right down to work. He's getting busy with the work. And so what do we find here? If we look in 13, 1 through 5, it says, Now there was in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. And they ministered to the Lord and fasted. The Holy Ghost said, Separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work whereunto I have called them. And when they had fasted and prayed and laid their hands on them, they sent them away. So they, being sent forth by the Holy Ghost, departed unto Seleucia, and from thence they sailed into Cyprus. And when they were at Salamis, they preached the word of God into the synagogues of the Jews, and they had also John to their minister. So this marks again where God has appointed and directed Paul. And remember that Paul isn't bragging about himself. He's doing all this work, and the Lord is commending him and recommending him, just like we saw back there in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, that he is commended of the Lord, he is used by the Lord, he is led by the Lord in all these types of things. And so, not only just, in these accounts here, but even throughout his ministry, it's, not him bragging on himself, but it is him explaining the things that he's going through and leaning on the Lord. So it continues to go through here. I'm not going to get into the missionary journeys or anything like that tonight. For time's sake, we may talk more about that in coming weeks. But he is known for his missionary journeys. He's taken these journeys that are taking him on hundreds of miles, years-long journeys. He's gone for years to this place and going through here and doing all these types of things, covering, hundreds, probably thousands of miles, in the grand scheme by completion, thousands of miles. And so at these times is when we find, probably Paul enduring such tribulation. And why is that? Well, obviously I think that because of the abundance of revelations, as he said in 2 Corinthians, but it's to keep him from being exalted above measure. You say, well, you know what? Paul went through all that stuff, and I'm just glad I don't have to go through all that stuff. There's no way that I could go through what Paul went through. Well, you know what? Paul, with what he was doing and where his heart was and the impact that he was having, I believe that he easily could have been, lifted up by others. He could have been exalted above measure. People would have started looking at him like some great, preacher, some great speaker, some great evangelist. I believe he probably wasn't, that mighty to look upon. I think that's why some people even said that he was, bold in his letters, but then meek and base in person, because, like little Paul, that's the guy that's been, writing these threatening letters. So he wasn't much to look upon. But so, do we really, want to do that work of Paul? Well, I think that we ought to, but this trial and this tribulation that came his way, I believe, as he said, is to keep him from being exalted above measure. It was the things that were done to him, the thorn in the flesh that it even says, that he calls it, but it was to keep him in a place where people would not have been exalting him higher than he ought to be exalted above measure, it says. So rather than preaching Paul here, I do want to look at just a couple of lessons that Paul was teaching to Christians, and two of them specifically. First one is that being disciplined includes controlling your thoughts and your emotions rather than having them control you. Like we were talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, our main passage, we were talking about bringing into captivity every thought. Actually having the wherewithal, having the determination, and having the discipline to bring our thoughts into captivity, to control the things that try to control us. And our thoughts and our emotions are definitely something that controls people. They are led by their emotions. They're led by their feelings, led by what they want to do. So if we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, here's really the challenge. All right, this is where it comes to us. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, this is a classic teaching. (24 to 27), just a small passage here. This comes after Paul talking about, how he's able to do all these things, and he's, all things to all men that he might save some. And he goes out and he does all these types of things, which, by the way, it takes such self-control to be able to do that, to go out and to, entertain, these different, I don't want to say lifestyles, but to go out here and to reach men in all different areas, really takes discipline and determination to be able to do that effectively, to not be swept up in what's going on, to not be swept up in what they're doing. You go to those places and you reach them for Christ. Takes a great bit of self-control. And so in 24, we see here of 1 Corinthians 9, it says, "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that ye may obtain. And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached unto others, I myself should be a castaway." So what do we find here is the work that goes into doing this kind of work, the man that's required to do this kind of work that Paul is doing here. And so what we see is, likening this unto being an athlete. What is the kind of work that goes into being an athlete? I mean, this is pretty easy for all of us to understand what kind of work goes into an athlete. You got all kinds of work. There's all kinds of knowledge that goes into it. There's all kinds of practice that goes into it. There's lots of devotion that's needed, dedication that's needed, perseverance. that's needed to be an athlete. It's not just to be an avid runner or an enthusiast or a hobby runner, but to be a competitor, to be somebody that actually goes out with the intention to win, okay? This is somebody that is determined to go out in the heat and in the cold, in the sick, and when it's pleasant or when it's not pleasant, when there's trials or when it's when you probably shouldn't go. Several weeks ago we were talking about our New Year's resolution and really, pushing it harder than we normally would. And that was even, a challenge to push it harder than people tell us that we should push it. You really should, maybe think about, cutting back a little bit. No, I'm going to keep going 100%, right? And so this is what the work entails for one who wants to be an athlete, to run a race and run to win. That's what the challenge is here. This is the type of man that Paul is. He's in the competition to win and to run, not just to show up. He is, it says in verse 26 there, I therefore run not as uncertainly. What's he saying here? He's like, I am running with a purpose. I know where I'm going. I know where the finish line is. Now, we're not talking about working for our salvation. We're not talking about trying to do some great thing here to impress God. But you know what? These men do it to win a crown corruptible, right? But the crown the reward that we have laid up for us as a soul winner is not corruptible. We're laying up treasure in heaven. Okay, this is what we're working for. So why would we work harder or fight harder for a corruptible crown, something of the earth, something that's going to burn up and pass away, something that'll be tried by fire and will be burned up, rather than setting up and store things that will last for all eternity, that moth and rust doth not corrupt. So what we find here is he is running with a purpose, not as uncertainly it says, so fight I not as one that beateth the air. So what's he talking about? He's making a difference. The guy that is just beaten in the air, he's just fighting nothing. All he's doing is wearing himself out, right? He's not making a difference. He's not making an impact. He's not doing anything productive at all. He's making himself tired. He's wearing himself out. He's probably looking like a fool, right? Just, swinging at nothing, swinging at the air. He's wearing himself out. It can be this way even in ministry, even in church. You seem like you got to step back sometimes and just be like, is what I'm doing actually accomplishing anything? Is it actually productive, or am I just trying to run and trying to attain and trying to keep up, and I'm ending up not doing anything? He says, wait a minute now. We need to be thinking about what it is that we're doing. Run with purpose and don't beat the air. Make a difference, he says. So we know that in 1 Timothy, we find it said that bodily exercise profiteth little, and godliness profits to all things. But he says there, rather exercise thyself rather unto godliness, it says in verse 7. So he's not saying here that we don't need to, worry about physical fitness or anything like this, but he says rather exercise yourself unto godliness. The same actions that you would take, the same determination that you would have to be an athlete, the same perseverance that is required, the same work and knowledge that's put into that, the same commitment that's put into that to being an athlete, do the same thing unto godliness, to be a Christian, to do the work of the Lord. Exercise is an activity requiring physical effort, and it's also a process carried out for a specific purpose. So like an exercise, like a military exercise or a physical exercise, but it's requiring a physical effort. Put some determination into it. People sit around like they're going to be some super Christian, but it's just going to come to them by osmosis, or they're just going to, well, maybe next year I'll be more where I want to be. Well, you know what? If you don't put in any work, then you're not going to be. You're not going to be any different next year than you were this year. You'll be in the same place, if not worse, or falling away. Right? The reason that I want to talk about this is because that things in our everyday lives require discipline. We have to be disciplined to do everything in our lives, whether it's spend time with our spouse, or get up and go to work in the morning, or, go to the grocery store and buy groceries, or take care of your own kids. I mean, it takes, discipline, it takes structure, it takes determination. Somebody that is lacking in those areas will get their kids taken away from them. They'll get their house taken away from them. They'll end up with out on the street because they, don't feel like going to work. I don't feel like, giving the kids baths or changing their clothes. No, I don't feel like, bringing any food into the house today. You know what? You cannot be profitable that way. You can't You can't profit that way. Yet, people, just walk in and out of churches like they're, some super Christian, but they're not putting in any work at all. Don't be lazy. The Bible says in Proverbs 28:26, he that trusteth in his own heart is a fool, but whoso walketh wisely shall be delivered. Trusting in our own heart. The reason why this is such an issue is because not only do people do what they feel, or they are led by emotion, but you'll hear people say even oftentimes, well, I just don't hear from God. I don't feel like God's really leading me this way. Does God really want me to do this? I mean, we were talking last week about, working for the Lord and following the Lord and doing the things that he wants you to do. And so somebody might sit back and they might say, well, I've never really heard from God that way. What would your advice be to them? I talked to a guy out soul winning last summer, and he's like, you know what? The biggest problem I have is I just never heard from God. I just never heard from him. I never felt anything from God. What do you do in that case? Well, you know what I see right here? We're talking about, Paul, a man who did hear from God, a man who did, see God, but nonetheless a man that got saved, got baptized, and got busy. All right, so what do we do in these situations here? Well, we've got plenty of instruction that we can do to be obedient to Christ, to follow the Lord, to walk in his word, to seek counsel from his word, to pattern our lives as after men who are following his word, who have put it into their lives that you can walk after. You're obedient to the work that the Lord has for us, and you know what it is by his instruction, okay? And you're faithful, and you walk, and you go. The thing is that people that say that they don't feel anything from God, or they don't hear from God, they use that as an excuse to be lazy, to not do anything because they haven't heard from God. Well, if God would just tell me to go and do that, you know what? God won't tell you to go and do that because you're looking for an out. You're looking for an excuse. You're looking for a reason to stop. The guy that I was talking to, when he told me that he had never heard from God, that was his justification. That was his reason to quit going to church. Now, I don't know what kind of church he was going to. May have been a church that he didn't need to be going to anyway. But when they use that as an excuse to not go to church, to not be around God's people, I mean, I'll tell you, a lot of times, what it is that motivates us is just the reproof, just the conviction, right? The heaviness that we feel sometimes is motivation. God's way is better than our heart's desires. Paul says, do the work. And, my advice to somebody in this situation that's saying that they don't feel like, God is with them, or they don't feel like this or feel like that, which first of all, they need to get saved. If they're, they need to make sure that they're saved. And that's standard with everybody that we talk to. We don't assume that anybody's ever saved. We'd like to find out if they are or not. But salvation's not a feeling. Okay? And people need to understand that. If salvation is a feeling, then you're going to be saved today and not saved tomorrow. Because that's the way we feel things, right? And so when you understand that salvation's not a feeling, and so God doesn't work off of feelings, and he doesn't control us just off of feelings, rather it's the truth of his word that we stand on, right? We're determined in our minds, we see these types of things. That's the same way that we can be motivated to go and to do the work. It's not with a feeling. You want to sit and you want to be stirred up, and have this, great charge and this great feeling to know that you're walking with God and he's happy with you and you can continue in the work, then friend, we're going to have to be having revivals around here every month to keep that kind of morale up. That's not what the work looks like. You know what? There's seasons where it feels really good, and there's seasons where we get this great reward, and there's, these great times that happen, but it's not every time. It's not every week. And we surely are not going to be having revivals every month. I'd like to not ever have one, because I feel like in my mind, revival is for when somebody's dead. Okay, that's when you need to be revived, is when you're dead. But you know what? That's just that's hyper emotional. And there's some churches like that. Churches like that all the time. They're emotionally charged, emotionally driven. I mean, you've seen them. You can look them up. I'm not thinking of one in particular, but goodness, the videos are out there. What's the Bible say? It says, study to show thyself approved, doesn't it? Study, that means put in the work. Put in the work. Well, I don't feel like doing the work. I don't feel like putting in the work. Well, we need to be disciplined towards God and towards His work, and we need to not be lazy. The second thing that we need to take away from this that I want to look at is don't expect others to have the same salvation experience that you had. Paul very easily could have gone out and when he was preaching the gospel said, well, if you haven't seen the light, if you haven't heard the voice, and if you don't know, if you didn't talk to God face to face, then you're not saved, right? But that's not what he preached at all. That's not what he preached, okay? We need to learn how God works in men's lives and relate to others, but don't expect everyone to see a light and to be blind for 3 days, to have the same testimony that you have. Don't expect everybody to do that. Now, I do believe that it's natural for us to be drawn to people, to see them get saved the same way that we got saved. Maybe not that we want to see them get saved the same way we did. Let me just put it this way. I really love talking to late teens, early 20s guys that will tell me they're an atheist. I love that. I love that conversation because that's exactly where I was at that point in my life, So when they're talking to me like that, then I know right where they're at, and I can, we have this, communication that we can have because that's kind of where I was. That's where I got saved. I feel like even with confrontational soul winning, I believe that you can identify that there's people that are very passionate about that got saved as adults, for example. I think when you get saved as an adult, you've lived it, you've got a past life, you've seen what the Bible said, you understand how Jesus came and saved you in the state that you were in, and so you are just super motivated to go out and to tell people. You want to see them get saved, and so you're out knocking on doors, you're telling everybody that you can. Whereas I've seen where maybe, for example, some people that grow up in church or the kids that grow up in church maybe got saved through a camp, a youth camp, a rally, a big night, a church night, a club meet, something like this. So then later on, they see the value in those things, and that's what they want to be involved in. That's what they want to try to reproduce, is those, clinics or camps or whatever. Now, these are just two examples, hopefully they're opposite enough that you can kind of see where I'm coming from with this, but there's lots of different aspects to this, okay? There's lots of different avenues. Some people might say, well, you know what, I got saved in a grocery store checkout line. The person behind me, got saved, told me about the Bible, and, I got saved standing in that grocery line. So I, am really convicted to go out and to just talk to people casually. I don't go door to door. I don't, I'm not confrontational. I'm not going to be a bully. I just want to go and have conversations with people. Okay. Some people are more, led to do that or feel like that's an effective way that they can go do that. But, so use those in that way, but don't expect people to have the same conversion that you had. And I have seen this, and I think you have too. I've heard testimonies of people that they had some, just revelation at some point. And because of that revelation, then if you don't have that same revelation, then you're most likely not saved. Most recently, I was talking to a man that had grown up in church. And so he had, known all about the Bible, known all about it his whole life. But it wasn't until he was older when he finally realized that it was all up in here and not in here. And so now as a soul winner, he goes out and he is just wrenching on people's hearts. Like he will not, give up until they have like this epiphany that their whole life, has just come crashing to this one point, and they need to just beg God for salvation in this moment right now. It all was kind of culminating to this point right now. And he says, well, if they don't get to this point, then why am I gonna lead them in a prayer? What he's doing is he's trying to replicate in them what happened to him, and it's not effective because different people get saved different ways. We're all kind of at a different point in our life, so we need to remember that. Now, in the Bible, we see so many miracles. We see demons expelled. We see people brought back to life. We see healings. We see visions. We see voices. We see all these things in the Bible. And I'm not saying that people are saved by those things. This is just the things that we see in the Bible, these types of different things. But if your testimony includes a particular, a little caveat or a little, thing that, really just made it real to you, okay, if I can say it that way, if it's got that, don't project that on somebody else as proof. And that's what people tend to do sometimes. They say, well, if you didn't see this, then you're definitely not saved. Or you definitely don't want it as bad as I wanted it when I got saved, so I don't think you really want it. And it sounds silly to talk about, but man, I've had a couple of conversations with people like that now, and I'm taken back by it. I say, really? So we're reminded of this also not only by Paul's testimony, by what he did, but back in our main passage, 2 Corinthians 10, in verse 7. Just briefly, it says, do you look on things after the outward appearance? If any man trusts to himself that he is Christ's, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ's, even so we are Christ's. And so this is basic, we know it's talking about people who were critical of Paul, critical of what he was doing. He's having to defend himself even in some of these things that he's doing. But we can even look at people and be like, well, you know what? They can't be saved because they weren't saved like I was saved. They didn't get saved in a certain church, or they didn't get saved this way, so they're definitely not saved. Now, as I've said already, we don't ever assume that anybody is saved. All right, I rather am of the mindset I'm going to assume somebody's lost until I know that they're saved. Right? I'm not saying I need to make everybody that I ever talk to prove to me that they're saved, but that's the mindset that I have going into the conversation. Is I want to know that they're actually saved, because as we know, a lot of people think they're going to heaven, but they're not trusting in Jesus Christ at all, which means that they are not saved. They're not going to heaven. So Paul, he was judged for not looking like a Christian, perhaps, much less a teacher. In person, maybe he was weak. They were expecting somebody that was tall and handsome and bold and a good orator, these types of things. But you know what? Salvation is not on the outward appearance. Salvation is not on what the outside looks like. It's the inside. There's plenty of people that have it all put together on the outside, but on the inside, they're filthy, they're vile, they're wicked, right? So you can't look on the outside. It's on the inside. And as we know in 1 John 5:10, he that believeth on the Son hath a witness in himself, right? So how do we know that a person is saved? Well, all they can do is tell us, but they're the one that has the witness of the Holy Spirit. They're the one that knows that they're saved or not. Now, hopefully they're honest with us. Sometimes they're honest and they communicate to us that they don't know for sure that they're saved. But if somebody tells me that they're saved and, they'll let me talk about the Bible, or maybe they won't, all I can do is take them at their word. I can't, judge them by their outward appearance or, go off on anything like that. So just think about that. Think about us as we have... as we go out and we're seeking how we can walk after the Lord and minister in the Lord's name, we have to have this determination and this discipline. And Paul is a good teacher of discipline, what that looks like and how to instill it in our lives, how to be led by the Spirit, making decisions not emotionally, but rationally based on the Word of God. That's what it always is. It's always based on the Word of God. And, as I was just talking about, people that'll say that they're saved or say that they're not saved, we're not the judge of that, but we can compare to what the Bible says, because that is what matters, is what the Bible says. So here we are, we're being disciplined to follow the Bible and not how we think or we feel like someone should look. So that being said, we'll be mindful of the decisions that we make and be mindful of the determination that we have and the discipline that we have. Not church discipline or anything like this, but just being disciplined, being a disciplined person. I think that's something that'll go a long way in each of our lives if we think about it. And, truly, I was thinking about that once, just think about discipleship, how important discipleship is and growing and walking with the Lord and learning the things of the Lord. Well, one of the biggest factors, look at the, root word right in discipleship, you see discipline, right in there. Be disciplined to do the work, disciplined to read the Bible, disciplined to, show up, disciplined to do these things. Discipleship can be good with that, but that's exactly what Paul is teaching here. These are the things that carry us through.